By the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front was a scar across the heart of Europe. The snow had melted into mud thick with the wreckage of war, burnt-out tanks, shattered helmets, and the bones of armies that had already died once. Yet neither side was finished. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler sought redemption. His new vision, a decisive counterblow that would crush the Red Army in one thunderous strike. That opportunity seemed to lie in a bulge on the map, the Kursk salient, a massive curve in the Soviet line that jutted deep into German-held territory. To Hitler, it looked like bait, a chance to encircle and annihilate Soviet forces in one grand offensive. He called it Operation Citadel, a plan meant to restore German dominance on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets had seen it coming. Months before the attack, Stalin's intelligence network had uncovered every detail. Instead of retreating, the Red Army dug in deeper than anyone in history. Over 1 million men, 5,000 tanks, and 20,000 guns fortified the ground around Kursk with minefields, trenches, and hidden artillery. It wasn't just defense, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. For the Germans, time was their enemy. Every delay meant more Soviet reinforcements, more fortifications, more death waiting ahead. Yet Hitler hesitated, insisting on waiting for the new Tiger and Panther tanks to arrive. Weeks turned into months, and the Red Army only grew stronger. When the offensive finally began in July 1943, it wasn't the bold lightning strike Germany had once mastered. It was a slow crawl into the jaws of a prepared enemy. The race to Kursk was already lost before the first tank moved, a race not for victory, but for survival in the inferno that was about to erupt. On the morning of July 5, 1943, the fields around Kursk trembled. At 2:30 a.m., the stillness of night was shattered by the thunder of Soviet artillery. For nearly an hour, shells rained down on German positions, lighting the horizon with fire. The Red Army had struck first, not to attack, but to blunt the spear before it could be thrown. Operation Citadel, Hitler's grand offensive, had begun under fire. When the bombardment lifted, the Germans surged forward. 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft pushed into the Soviet lines. The ground shook beneath the weight of panzers as Tiger and Panther tanks led the charge, their cannons thundering through the dawn haze. Hitler had promised a decisive blow, a lightning strike that will turn the tide of war. But the enemy ahead was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever faced. At the northern tip of the salient, General Model's 9th Army attacked toward the city of Kursk itself. Progress was slow. The Soviets had laid an ocean of mines, over 500,000 in some sectors, designed to cripple tanks before they even reached the first defensive belt. Each explosion sent black earth skyward, flipping steel monsters like toys. German engineers crawled forward under fire to clear paths, only for new mines to be laid again by Soviet infantry at night. In the south, General Hother's 4th Panzer Army, reinforced by SS Panzer Corps, advanced toward the town of Prokhorovka. The landscape was a maze of trenches, bunkers, and hidden gun nests. Every hedgerow concealed a waiting ambush, every rise in the ground masked a Soviet anti-tank gun. The Germans fought inch by inch, their once feared blitzkrieg reduced to grinding attrition. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies at first. Dive bombers screamed down on Soviet strongpoints, and waves of Stukas tore through columns of armor. Yet even as they struck, new Soviet fighters, Yak-9s and La-5s, rose to challenge them. For the first time, the Germans no longer held absolute air superiority. The sky became a battlefield of its own, filled with black smoke and falling debris. On the ground, the Tigers roared ahead, powerful but few. Their thick armor could shrug off Soviet shells, and their 88mm guns tore through T-34s at long range. Yet they were slow, prone to breakdowns, and fuel-hungry. As the days passed, more and more Tigers sat immobile in the dust, victims not of enemy fire, but of mechanical failure and exhaustion. By July 7th, the front had become a landscape of chaos, villages reduced to ash, forests flattened by shellfire, and the air heavy with the stench of burning oil and cordite. The Germans had advanced barely 10 kilometers in the north, 20 in the south. Every mile cost dozens of tanks and hundreds of lives. In the Soviet trenches, morale hardened rather than broke. Commissars reminded their men, "Behind us is the motherland. There is nowhere else to go." Soldiers fought from dugouts until tanks rolled over their positions, then climbed out and fired from behind. Snipers picked off officers, and entire German squads disappeared into the cornfields, never to return. Still, Hitler demanded progress. He refused to see that the element of surprise was gone, that the Red Army was drawing him into a killing ground of its own design. Operation Citadel was meant to be a swift strike, but it had become a test of endurance, a duel of attrition the Germans could not afford. By the end of the first week, the German spearheads were bleeding strength. The momentum that once defined the Wehrmacht had slowed to a crawl. The myth of invincibility, born in Poland, proven in France, and carried through the steppes of Russia, began to crack. And in that widening gap between ambition and reality, the largest tank battle in history was about to erupt, at a place called Prokhorovka. By July 11, 1943, the German offensive had begun to lose its teeth. The panzers were still advancing, but slower, weaker, and through fields littered with the smoking carcasses of their own machines. What had begun as a calculated strike was now a desperate crawl through mud, mines, and fire. Yet deep within the Soviet lines, another storm was gathering, one the Germans never saw coming. The Red Army had been waiting. Every trench, every gun, every reserve division had been placed not to stop the Germans, but to bleed them. And when the moment came, Stalin's commanders, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vatutin, were ready to strike back. At dawn on July 12, the counterattack began. More than 1,500 Soviet tanks rolled forward across the southern sector near the town of Prokhorovka, meeting head-on with the elite SS Panzer Corps. What followed was chaos on a scale the world had never seen. The morning mist was torn apart by the thunder of engines, the clash of steel, and the deafening roar of cannon fire. The largest tank battle in human history had begun. T-34s surged forward in waves, their silhouettes barely visible through smoke and dust. They charged at full speed, not in neat formations, but as swarms, closing the distance before the Tigers and Panthers could pick them off at range. The battlefield turned into a maelstrom of collisions, explosions, and fire. Tanks rammed tanks, guns fired point blank, and the air burned with the heat of 1,000 infernos. Soviet tank crews fought with reckless determination. Many had never faced the German heavy armor before, but they knew their orders: close the gap, engage, overwhelm. For every Tu-34 destroyed, another two seemed to emerge from behind the hills. The Germans, though better trained and armed, were now drowning in numbers. Their precision was no match for the chaos that surrounded them. Above, the sky was thick with aircraft. Soviet Illinois II Sturmovix, known as flying tanks, swooped low to strike German armor, while the Luftwaffe scrambled to hold its ground. Bombs fell on both sides of the front line, and the ground quaked as if the earth itself was at war. For hours, the two sides battled at point-blank range. The sound was unending, metal shrieking, engines roaring, men shouting through smoke. By noon, much of the battlefield had become a twisted graveyard of steel. Entire units disappeared into the inferno. The SS Panzer Corps, once considered invincible, was being ground down tank by tank, crew by crew. But the Soviet counterattack wasn't confined to Prokhorovka. Across the front, fresh divisions struck the German flanks, cutting off supply lines and threatening encirclement. Rokossovsky's armies in the north pressed forward relentlessly, while the Bryansk front advanced toward Oral. For the first time in months, the Germans were being pushed back everywhere at once. Inside German command posts, panic began to seep in. Reports from the field were fragmented, confused. Enemy armor advancing from all directions. Requesting reinforcements. No fuel. No ammunition. The tone had shifted from confidence to despair. The once coordinated assault had devolved into survival. By the evening of July 12, the battle at Prokhorovka had raged for over 10 hours. The fields that morning had been green with wheat. By nightfall, they were blackened and burning. Over 600 tanks lay destroyed in just a few square miles, their twisted hulks marking the scale of the carnage. Neither side had achieved a clean victory, but the Germans had lost what they could least afford: momentum. When word reached Hitler that Soviet counterattacks were breaking through across the front and that the Allies had landed in Sicily, his patience snapped. He ordered Operation Citadel to be called off. The dream of a decisive victory at Kursk was over. For the Wehrmacht, the counterattack was more than a military defeat, it was a revelation. The Red Army was no longer retreating. It was learning, adapting, overpowering. The hunter of Europe had become the hunted. And from that moment on, the road that once led east toward conquest began to turn west, toward inevitable defeat. By July 1943, the Battle of Kursk had become a brutal test of endurance, a clash not just of armies, but of machines, minds, and morale. Hitler's grand gamble, Operation Citadel, aimed to encircle the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient using the Wehrmacht's newest weapons, the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks. On paper, these steel beasts were unstoppable. On the battlefield, they met a nightmare forged by Soviet preparation and the merciless Russian land itself. The offensive began with confidence. The Tigers, heavy and imposing, rolled forward with precision, their 88mm guns tearing through Soviet armor. But within days, progress slowed to a crawl. Kursk was no open desert or French countryside, it was a fortress. The Soviets had laid nearly 500,000 mines, dug endless trenches, and set up killing zones covered by overlapping artillery. Every few meters demanded blood and fuel. Fuel, however, was running dry. The Tigers, powerful but gluttonous, consumed more gasoline than the supply lines could deliver. Mechanics worked under fire to repair snapped treads and overheated engines. The ground itself turned against them, soft summer mud swallowed entire tanks, immobilizing them for hours. What was meant to be a swift armored thrust became a grinding, mechanical agony. Meanwhile, Soviet defenses grew bolder. Anti-tank guns, camouflaged among trees and ridges, unleashed coordinated barrages. The famed T-34s, lighter, faster, and endlessly replaceable, began to outmaneuver their heavier rivals. For every Tiger that advanced, 2 were stalled or disabled. German radio transmissions grew desperate. Fuel exhausted. Tank immobilized. Enemy closing from both flanks. The battlefield that once thundered with German engines soon echoed only with the crash of shells and the cries of men. Luftwaffe dominance, once a given, had evaporated. Soviet aircraft, led by Illinois II Sturmoviks, swept the skies, strafing convoys and bombing supply routes. Without air cover, the Tigers became targets in the open, great iron fortresses slowly being dismantled by fire from above and below. By mid-July, the offensive had lost all momentum. Divisions like Großdeutschland and Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, once the pride of the German army, were shattered. The fields around Prokhorovka, where hundreds of tanks clashed in the largest armored battle in history, became a graveyard of steel. The Tiger's thick armor could repel shells, but not the inevitability of exhaustion and encirclement. Some crews, realizing the futility, destroyed their own tanks to avoid capture. Others fled on foot through burning fields. One officer recorded bitterly, "Our Tigers burn not from enemy fire, but from despair." When the final order to withdraw came, it was not shouted but whispered. Operation Citadel had failed. Kursk had devoured the Wehrmacht's strength and shattered its myth of superiority. As the smoke settled, the truth was undeniable. The Tiger advance had collapsed, not from a single decisive blow, but from the slow, relentless weight of Soviet resistance and German overconfidence. The battlefield that was meant to restore German momentum instead marked its irreversible decline. The fields of Kursk lay silent, littered with the twisted wreckage of the Reich's finest armor, monuments to hubris, swallowed by the land they had once sought to conquer. From that summer onward, the Eastern Front would never again belong to Germany. The tide had turned, and the roar of the Tigers faded into history. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was a reckoning. When the Sixth Army fell, the illusion of German invincibility fell with it. The tide of war, which had once surged eastward with unstoppable force, began to flow the other way. From the ruins of Stalingrad, a new chapter of the war began, one written not in triumph, but in retribution. The Red Army, hardened by unimaginable loss, now carried the momentum. City by city, they pushed west, reclaiming the shattered lands of their homeland. Each step forward was paid for with blood, but it was a march that would not stop until the Reich itself lay in ruins. For every German soldier who once believed he was conquering history, history had begun to conquer him. Inside Germany, the news spread like a sickness. Mothers wept over the word missing. Fathers stared at empty chairs that would never be filled again. The propaganda that had promised victory now spoke of sacrifice and honor, hollow words to disguise the truth that the war had turned, and it would never turn back. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a wound that never healed. His generals had warned him, his soldiers had begged him, but pride drowned every voice of reason. The empire he had built on fear began to crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. For the world, Stalingrad became a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of how even the mightiest armies can break when their cause is hollow. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and the slow, unstoppable rise of Soviet power. But beyond the politics and the shifting borders, Stalingrad's true legacy is written in the faces of those who suffered there, German and Russian alike. It reminds us that war has no victors, only survivors. The city that once burned now stands rebuilt, its scars buried beneath new streets, but the earth still remembers. The tide turned at Stalingrad, not just in strategy, but in spirit. It was the moment when cruelty met its mirror, and the frozen Volga carried away the dreams of conquest. From that point onward, the march of the Wehrmacht was no longer forward, it was backward, retreat by retreat, until Berlin itself would fall beneath the same sky that once watched Stalingrad burn. The tide of war had turned, and with it, the fate of the world. Pas de Calais. Reinforcements never came. On the ground, desperation replaced duty. The Wehrmacht fought with courage but faced the unstoppable naval fire, armor, and endless waves of men. By nightfall, resistance became chaos. Entire units withdrew into the countryside, abandoning the fortifications they had spent years building. The Atlantic Wall was nothing but rubble and memory. Retreat turned to panic. Soldiers trudged through mud and fire, dragging the wounded, haunted by the sound of Allied guns behind them. Civilians watched in silence as the occupiers who once ruled them fled. The myth of invincibility was dying in the ashes of Normandy. By June 7th, German command knew the truth: the front was broken beyond repair. Normandy was lost. The wall that was meant to hold for 1,000 years had fallen in a single day. As the sun set over the burning coast, one truth echoed through the ruins. The hunters of Europe had become the hunted.